This is Chapter 7, Screencast 5, continuing on with genetically modified organisms for food. And I wanted to add one more regarding the effects on biodiversity. So one issue is that you could have two farms side by side, one with GMO plants and one without. And nature spreads the seeds around. So some of the GMO seeds could end up in the non-GMO farm. And over time, that could affect biodiversity if they outcompete with the non-GMO versions of that plant. That will lead to more identical, non-biodiverse crops. Okay, moving on to the third point again, how to regulate genetically modified organisms. So that became complicated. As with many other industries, such as the energy industry, the regulation is really self-regulating. So people, for example, who might serve on the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, began their careers as people who study crops or farm, etc. And so they may have a particular outlook on that. That's just human nature. A similar situation occurred, for instance, the airline industry is regulated by the airline industry, or the nuclear industry is regulated by people who have been involved in the nuclear field, and that's how they became the experts, and that's why that was necessary. So then the problem actually expands from there. So there are some companies such as Monsanto, who developed genetically modified crop organisms or genetically modified plants. And they argued that they then owned the patent to that plant. And so that causes a couple of problems. One is because many of these seeds are kill seeds, they don't produce, let's say it's corn, they won't produce seeds that can be used to grow more crops. And so the farmer, once they purchase from a company like this, will need to continue to purchase new seeds every year. So a company like Monsanto would maintain control, economic control of a large part of the industry. And they also were involved in lawsuits about that. If they found genetically modified plants on someone's property, someone's farm, that did not buy from them, then it was considered stolen property. So that also was an issue that ran through the courts. But the basic idea of owning something or patenting the genetically modified organism went as high as the Supreme Court, which ruled that that was legitimate to do. I do just want to point out one little issue, is that one of the Supreme Court justices was a former employee of Monsanto for many years and did not recluse himself from that particular case. Okay, so let's see. I think that's all I want to cover right now on GMOs. And I'm going to move on to energy subsidy. Let me just make sure I reviewed everything I want to. Okay, so we're going to move on to energy subsidy now. Oops. Okay, the energy subsidy in agriculture. So in addition to solar energy, which there's an abundant supply just coming to Earth naturally, so in addition to solar energy, a large quantity of fossil fuel and human energy goes into agriculture. So in the days before industrial agriculture, certainly there was human energy and animal energy that went into planting and plowing and harvesting crops. Now, since industrialization, there is a very large quantity of fossil fuels that is going into energy. And so we look at the term energy subsidy, which is the amount of energy input required per calorie of food produced. And so that energy includes, obviously, the fossil fuel energy. So here's an example. 5 calories of energy are needed to produce a particular food. And when we eat that food, we receive 1 calorie of energy from it. Then the food has an energy subsidy of 5. In other words, it takes 5 calories worth of energy input for us to get 1 calories worth of energy out of it, that food. So we can see that would be a problem, particularly as we have a growing population. So in the modern U.S. diet, there is a 10-calorie energy input or 10-calorie subsidy for every 1 calorie you eat. That energy was required to plant, fertilize, irrigate, harvest, transport, and sell food products. And most of that energy is from fossil fuel energy. So you can see that anywhere in this formula that we can reduce the amount of energy required, then the better it would be for our health and the environmental health. So for example, transport. If you eat locally, less transportation is needed, so less gasoline for trucks, for example, and that way we can reduce the energy subsidy. So we're going to look at this diagram showing various degrees of energy subsidy. When we were hunters and gatherers, it only took 0.1 calorie of energy for every 1 calorie that the human got out of that. And all of these less than 1 would be break even or better. So small scale corn is 0.2, large scale corn is up to 0.5, small scale eggs are at 1, small scale eggs are slightly under 1, coastal fishing is at 1. Once we move beyond that, it takes more energy, a lot more energy than we get out of it. So it takes 2 calories of energy here, let's say about 3 or 2.5 for large scale eggs, higher, about maybe 4 for grass-fed beef. That was our typical U.S. diet in 1950, and here we move up to the typical U.S. diet now of 10, and partly that is due to a large amount of feedlot beef. Feedlot beef is beef that's grown in an enclosed area rather than grazing freely, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then we have offshore fishing, which is even worse at 20. And what happens there is they go very far offshore and take big boats giant boats with refrigeration and stay out to sea for long periods of time, harvesting fish and putting them in these refrigerators and then bringing them back to shore. And as an aside, they can be classified as fresh, not frozen, if they just bring the temperature down to very close to freezing, but not quite, and that allows for even more confusion, I guess. Okay. So now we're going to briefly consider some alternative methods of farming. These are gaining more and more attention as people realize the environmental consequences and potential human health consequences to our current methods. So I just want to remind you again that conventional agriculture means industrial agriculture. And that's where there's reduced labor by using machinery, pesticides, and so forth, and usually involves heavy amounts of fossil fuel input. The term for the previous types of farming include traditional farming. So traditional farming could be shifting agriculture, and that's very widely used in the developing world. So they have a plot of land with plants on it, often trees, and clear it with fire. The soil at first seems very nutrient rich because you have the material that's left over from the trees that were burned, providing a fertilizer. But the plants quickly deplete that, and often there's insufficient rain as well. And so then the agriculture moves on to a new plot of land which is burned, and the old plot, which is not as productive, is then sold to someone who it's worth less, so then it's sold to someone who has less money. And this, of course, has high environmental impacts. A second type of traditional agriculture is nomadic grazing. So sometimes there's soil that's very low in productivity, so it only produces maybe some grass or some small shrubs. And that can't be used for growing crops because it's not productive enough. However, pastoral animals can graze on that grass, and sometimes move even seasonally from one plot to another. And so as they move, that's nomadic. And that's generally not too damaging to the environment. But again, of course, it depends on the carrying capacity and the number of pastoral animals that are brought to graze. Okay, a third concept, which is gaining attention nowadays, is intercropping. And that's when two or more crops are planted in the same area at the same time. A subcategory of that is agricultural forestry, in which trees and vegetables are intercropped. So think for a minute why that might be advantageous to have trees and vegetables intercropped or grown in the same area. Think of what services those trees might provide for those vegetables being grown. So I'll continue and answer that question on intercropping in just a minute, but first I want to mention that the goal more and more of our agricultural systems is to have sustainable agriculture, which can produce enough food to feed the world's population without destroying the land, polluting the environment, or reducing biodiversity. And in sustainable agriculture, the quality of the soil is paid attention to very carefully. Make sure it has the right mixture of nutrients, minerals, not too much salts, and make sure it has enough carbon. So all of these things are closely watched or monitored. And then we want to be able to produce food for the long term, not the short term. So let's take a look back at that. So sustainable agriculture includes many traditional types of processes. One you may have heard of is crop rotation. So year after year, each year, instead of growing the same crop over and over again, which depletes certain nutrients more than others, you rotate crops so that you have a crop one year that may add one nutrient to the soil and take away another. Then you rotate that out and you move in a crop that does just the opposite, rotates in the first nutrient and rotates out the second one. So that's crop rotation, and that's been around for centuries, but has not dominated our industrial agriculture. Okay, a second form of sustainable agriculture, which is traditional, is intercropping, and that's using two or more crop species in the same field at the same time. In particular, agroforestry, that should really be a subcategory of the intercropping, involves having trees with the vegetables. So I mentioned that there would be some advantages to growing trees with the vegetables, and hopefully you've thought of some of them. One is they can serve as wind blocks, particularly in an area where wind might be a problem for the particular vegetables. And second, they may contain organisms, particularly birds, that dine on the insects that might otherwise eat or destroy the vegetables. And so having this natural pest control provided by the birds in the trees is very beneficial. And last but not least, we have contour plowing. Contour plowing is when there are the land is carved in little plateaus to prevent erosion. Contour plowing went into place, it's been in place for centuries, but it really helped out during the Dust Bowl, during the Great Depression, and allowed the land to stop eroding and the dust from being blown, and just by putting in these contours. Okay, so that is a wrap for sustainable agriculture, and now we'll move on to the next topic.